Christina Onassis inherited a billion-dollar empire. Her first move, destroying Jacqueline Kennedy. She didn't see Jackie O as an American icon. She saw a gold-digging parasite. She weaponized her fortune, handing Jackie $26 million in cash, strictly to legally erase her from the family. Christina won the war. She successfully evicted her stepmother. But the victory left her with nothing. At 37, the billionaire who bought out Jackie Kennedy was found dead in a bathtub, entirely alone. Christina Onassis was born on December 11, 1950, in New York City. Her birth was a medical calculation, not an act of parental love. Her father, Aristotle Onassis, already had a 2-year-old son, Alexander. He had his male heir to inherit the shipping empire. He did not want a daughter. Her mother, Tina Levanos, accidentally fell pregnant and immediately sought an abortion. However, doctors in 1950 warned Tina that the procedure carried a high risk of permanent infertility. Tina was trapped in a loveless, strategic marriage. She kept the baby solely to ensure she could bear children for a future husband if she divorced Aristotle. From day one, Christina was nothing more than a biological insurance policy. The maternal rejection was physical and immediate. Tina was obsessed with classical beauty. She was blonde, thin, and socially flawless. She expected a daughter who looked exactly like her. Instead, Christina inherited her father's heavy build, prominent nose, and deep, dark under-eye circles. Tina did not hide her disgust. She treated her daughter's face as a personal embarrassment. She maintained a strict emotional and physical distance from Christina. This immediate rejection installed a permanent psychological defect in Christina. She learned before she could speak that her body was flawed and unlovable. Aristotle found the physical resemblance amusing, but he was a ghost in her life. He called her Chrysomu, yet he offered zero parental presence. He prioritized his global shipping fleet and his mistresses. He substituted affection with extreme wealth. He bought her miniature Dior dresses and filled her nurseries with expensive toys. Despite the money, Christina grew up in a total vacuum. The Onassis family owned apartments in Manhattan, estates in Europe, and a 325-foot yacht. For Christina, these were not homes. They were heavily staffed holding facilities. She was raised entirely by a rotating roster of nannies and governesses. They were paid to manage her, not to care for her. She had no consistent peer group. She was continuously moved between elite boarding schools in Paris, London, and Switzerland. This constant relocation prevented her from forming a single lasting friendship. She was a solitary child living in vast, empty rooms. By the age of 5, the absolute emotional deprivation reached a breaking point. Christina executed a calculated psychological strike to force her parents to notice her. She stopped speaking. This was not a temporary childhood tantrum. It was a complete deliberate withdrawal. She refused to utter a single word to her parents, her brother, or her nannies. The sudden silence disrupted the smooth operation of the Onassis household. Her parents could not ignore it. They hired Swiss psychiatrists to analyze her. The clinical diagnosis was mercurial mutism. It is a severe psychological defense mechanism. By turning off her voice, Christina weaponized silence. It was the only form of control a powerless, neglected child possessed. By refusing to speak, she forced the adults to stop ignoring her and focus entirely on diagnosing her. The psychiatric intervention eventually coaxed her back into speaking, but the root cause, the absolute lack of familial love, remained entirely untreated. The fragile structure of her childhood collapsed completely when she was 9 years old. Aristotle engaged in a highly public affair with the opera singer Maria Callas. He flaunted the relationship across European society, humiliating Tina. In 1960, Tina officially filed for divorce. For a 9-year-old girl already suffering from severe attachment trauma, the divorce was the ultimate abandonment. Christina did not process this as a legal split. She processed it as the destruction of her only safety net. Her reaction was highly focused anger. She directed her hatred entirely at Maria Callas, blaming the singer for destroying her life. She refused to interact with Callas and spoke of her with open contempt. The divorce finalized Christina's psychological isolation. Her mother immediately moved on to new social circles and subsequent marriages, leaving Christina behind. Her father became further engrossed in Callas and his businesses. No one prioritized the 9-year-old girl. Christina later summarized the psychological brutalism of this exact moment with a single fact: "I had to start being an adult at 9. She entered adolescence with zero self-esteem, a deep-seated hatred for her own physical appearance, and the absolute certainty that she was alone. Between January 1973 and March 1975, the Onassis family was systematically eradicated. The events of this period were not merely tragic, they were structurally catastrophic for a billion-dollar empire. For Christina, this era cemented a permanent psychological condition known as survivor's guilt. It also forced her to weaponize herself against a world entirely populated by opportunistic men. The timeline of destruction began with the one person who gave Christina a sense of grounding, her older brother, Alexander. In the patriarchal architecture of the Greek shipping industry, Alexander Onassis was the undisputed golden child. He was 2 years older than Christina, charismatic, and specifically groomed by their father, Aristotle, to inherit the maritime monopoly. Alexander was the president of Olympic Aviation, the regional subsidiary of the family's national airline. While Christina was bounced between boarding schools and marginalized, Alexander was stationed in the boardroom. Despite this massive disparity in their father's treatment, the siblings shared a tight bond. They were unified by the shared trauma of their parents' highly public divorce and their mutual, intense hatred for their stepmother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Alexander was Christina's only true ally inside the family. On the afternoon of January 22, 1973, that alliance was permanently severed. Alexander was conducting a routine flight at Ellinikon International Airport in Athens. He was evaluating a new pilot in a Piaggio P-136L2 amphibious aircraft. Shortly after takeoff, the plane banked violently to the right and smashed into the runway. The new pilot and a mechanic survived with severe injuries. Alexander, seated in the right-hand seat, took the brunt of the impact. He suffered catastrophic head trauma. The immediate aftermath was a display of absolute panicked power. Aristotle Onassis, receiving the news in New York, instantly mobilized his resources. He chartered a private jet and flew the top neurosurgeons from the United States and the United Kingdom directly to the KT Hospital in Athens. But unlimited wealth could not repair a shattered skull. The surgeons examined Alexander and delivered a unified clinical verdict to Aristotle. The brain damage was irreparable. The 24-year-old heir was brain dead. Christina stood in the sterile hospital corridor as her father faced a decision he never calculated into his business plans. Aristotle was forced to authorize the removal of his son's life support. He could not bear to be in the room when the machines were turned off. He walked out of the hospital, leaving Alexander to die. The death of Alexander broke Aristotle Onassis. His hair turned white almost overnight. He refused to accept that the crash was a mechanical failure or a pilot error. Driven by severe paranoia, he offered a $1 million reward for proof that the plane was sabotaged by his business rivals or political enemies. He spent his days sitting by Alexander's grave on the private island of Scorpios, drinking heavily and speaking to the dirt. For Christina, the immediate shock of losing her brother was compounded by a terrifying reality shift. Overnight, the secondary unwanted daughter became the sole surviving heir to the Onassis empire. The entire weight of $1 billion syndicate comprising 50 supertankers, international banks, and an airline was suddenly strapped to the shoulders of a deeply insecure, unguided 22-year-old woman. She had no formal business training. She had never been invited into the boardrooms. Now, the aging, deeply conservative Greek executives who ran her father's companies looked at her with undisguised skepticism. Before Christina could process her new corporate burden, the second wave of tragedy hit. In October 1974, 21 months after Alexander's death, Christina was summoned to Paris. Her mother, Tina Livanos, was dead at the age of 45. Tina's death was deeply disturbing and triggered an intense, paranoid reaction from Christina. Tina was found lifeless in her bed at the Hôtel de Chanelay. At the time of her death, Tina was married to Stavros Niarchos. This marriage was a dark knot in the family history. Niarchos was Aristotle Onassis's greatest business rival. Furthermore, Niarchos had previously been married to Tina's own sister, Eugenie. 4 years prior, Eugenie had died of a barbiturate overdose while married to Niarchos, a death that sparked a massive controversial police investigation. Now, Tina had died under similar sudden circumstances while married to the same man. The initial medical report issued in Paris cited a heart attack and acute pulmonary edema as the cause of death. Christina refused to accept this. She knew her mother had fallen into severe depression following Alexander's death, but she absolutely distrusted Stavros Niarchos. Driven by suspicion and grief, Christina hired her own lawyers and aggressively petitioned the French authorities to halt the burial and conduct a full independent autopsy. She publicly suggested foul play. The French prosecutors agreed to the autopsy. The toxicological results were brutal for Christina to read. There was no murder. Tina Livanos had died from a massive, self-administered overdose of barbiturates. The drugs had stopped her heart and filled her lungs with fluid. Christina was forced to drop her accusations against Niarchos, but the psychological damage was permanent. She realized that her family's immense wealth provided zero protection against despair. Her mother had simply chosen to stop living. The rejection that defined Christina's childhood was now finalized by her mother's suicide. By the winter of 1974, the Onassis family was reduced to just 2 people, Christina and her father. But Aristotle was rapidly deteriorating. The grief over Alexander had destroyed his immune system. He developed myasthenia gravis, a severe neuromuscular disease that systematically weakens the skeletal muscles. The disease ravaged the once powerful patriarch. His eyelids drooped so severely that he was forced to tape them to his forehead just to see. In early 1975, Aristotle was admitted to the American Hospital of Paris. He was suffering from severe gallbladder complications compounded by his muscular disease. Christina relocated to Paris, keeping a constant vigil at his bedside. Her relationship with her father was highly complex. He had neglected her for most of her life, yet he was the only anchor she had left. She aggressively managed his medical care, fighting with doctors and attempting to control the uncontrollable decline of his body. On March 15, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died at the age of 69. At 24 years old, Christina Onassis was completely orphaned. In less than 2.5 years, she had buried her brother, her mother, and her father. She stood entirely alone at the apex of the global shipping industry. Her inheritance was staggering, but heavily conditioned. According to Aristotle's final will, the empire was split. Christina inherited 55% of the total assets, cementing her status as one of the richest women on the planet. This included direct control over the commercial shipping fleet, highly lucrative real estate in Manhattan, and various international holding companies. The remaining 45% of the estate was mandated to fund the creation of the Alexander S. Onassis Public Benefit Foundation, an organization designed to honor her late brother. Christina was named the president of this foundation. The global financial press fully expected the grieving, inexperienced heiress to sell off the fleet or hand total control to her father's seasoned male executives. They drastically underestimated the survival instinct forged by her trauma. Christina did not retreat. She weaponized her grief into extreme, focused control. She recognized that the old guard of the Onassis Company, a group of fiercely loyal but patronizing Greek men known as the Palatine Guard, viewed her as a naive girl. She systematically dismantled that perception. She refused to be a figurehead. She demanded to be educated on the exact mechanics of the business. She memorized global oil prices, tanker tonnage capacities, and international maritime law. When the executives attempted to make decisions without her, she fired them or publicly reprimanded them, establishing a reputation for a volatile but highly effective temper. She also made calculated, aggressive legal maneuvers to protect her wealth. The United States government, heavily taxing her inherited assets and scrutinizing the Onassis operations, posed a massive threat to her control. In a highly controversial move, Christina officially renounced her American citizenship. This was not a political statement. It was a cold financial strategy to shield her empire from double taxation and U.S. federal jurisdiction. She operated out of Monte Carlo and Athens, utilizing dual Greek and Argentine passports to navigate international borders flawlessly. By the end of 1975, Christina Onassis had successfully stabilized the companies and solidified her absolute authority. She proved she possessed her father's sharp, ruthless business acumen. She negotiated fiercely, managed thousands of employees, and expanded the company's real estate portfolio. Yet, this corporate dominance was a facade covering a totally shattered psyche. She sat in the highest offices in Monaco and New York, directing millions of dollars with a single phone call, but she returned to empty penthouses. She was entirely consumed by the belief that her family was cursed. She survived the 29-month eradication of her bloodline, but the survivor's guilt mutated into severe paranoia. She realized she could control the global oil shipping market, but she could not control the people around her. And so, with her family gone, she turned her vast financial arsenal toward a new target, the stepmother she despised, Jacqueline Kennedy. Christina Onassis's approach to conflict was entirely defined by her absolute, unyielding hatred for Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. This was not a standard domestic dispute between a stepdaughter and a stepmother. It was a high-stakes, ruthless financial war fought on a global stage between two incredibly powerful women. It was a clash of two distinct empires, the American political royalty of the Kennedys and the fiercely guarded, sovereign wealth of the Greek Onassis dynasty. The origin of this hostility was deeply rooted. Since her parents' bitter divorce in 1960, Christina had harbored a persistent, naive hope that Aristotle and Tina would eventually reunite. That illusion was permanently destroyed on October 20, 1968. On that day, Aristotle Onassis married the world's most famous widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, on his heavily guarded private island of Scorpios. Christina, then 17 years old, was utterly devastated. She stood through the Greek Orthodox ceremony, weeping openly, making no attempt to hide her distress from the global press. She viewed the marriage not as a romantic union, but as a hostile corporate takeover of her family. To Christina, Jackie was an intruder. She was a polished, hyper-calculated American who brought nothing but relentless paparazzi and immense financial demands into their lives. Christina dismissed the former First Lady completely, famously referring to Jackie in private circles as my father's unfortunate obsession. The animosity was mutual, immediate, and impossible to conceal. Jackie possessed a highly curated, PR-driven demeanor, but she quickly realized that she had zero authority over her new stepdaughter. When a rebellious, early 20s Christina fled to New York to live with a lover named Danny Marentet, Jackie attempted to intervene. Acting as the family matriarch, Jackie confronted Christina in Manhattan, urging her to end the public spectacle and return home. Christina's response was a masterclass in psychological warfare. To immediately shut down the conversation and humiliate Jackie, Christina fabricated a severe lie on the spot. She flatly announced she was pregnant. The tactic worked perfectly. Shocked and lacking any real maternal leverage, Jackie retreated entirely. Christina had established the dynamic. She would not be managed, and she certainly would not be managed by a Kennedy. This deep-seated hostility was fully validated in Christina's eyes during Aristotle's final years. The marriage between Aristotle and Jackie had rapidly deteriorated. The massive spending, the constant media circus, and a fundamental lack of compatibility had driven them apart. By the time Aristotle fell terminally ill in 1974, he was actively consulting his lawyers in Athens to draft divorce papers. He had recognized his mistake, but he died in March 1975 before the legal severing could be finalized. Because the divorce was never filed, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was legally his widow. This set the stage for one of the most vicious inheritance battles of the 20th century. The war began on the day of Aristotle's funeral on Scorpios. The optics were critical. Millions of people were watching the broadcast. The Onassis public relations team orchestrated a unified front, instructing Christina and Jackie to share a limousine for the short drive from the church to the burial site. They entered the car together. However, just minutes into the ride, Christina's rage overrode the PR strategy. Unable to tolerate sitting next to the woman she blamed for exploiting her father, Christina abruptly ordered the driver to stop the car in the middle of the road. She stepped out, abandoning Jackie in the vehicle, and walked to a trailing car. She did this directly in front of the International Press Corps. It was a silent, brutal declaration of war. The facade of family unity was dead before Aristotle was even in the ground. The real battleground, however, was the boardroom. Aristotle Onassis was a highly paranoid and calculating man, especially regarding his assets. Before his death, he had anticipated Jackie might try to seize a massive portion of his empire. To prevent this, he had left a highly restrictive will. Under the terms of the document, Jackie was to receive an annual stipend of $250,000 for the rest of her life. For a woman of her social standing and spending habits, this was an insultingly low figure. To enforce this restriction, Aristotle had inserted a lethal legal trap. The will stipulated that if Jackie challenged the $250,000 allowance in any court, or if she demanded a larger share of the estate, she would instantly forfeit the stipend entirely. Furthermore, Aristotle had leveraged a prenuptial agreement, a document Jackie had signed in 1968, waiving her right to inherit under standard Greek widow laws. Aristotle believed he had effectively boxed her in. He underestimated the Kennedy political machine. Jackie refused to accept the terms. She immediately mobilized a team of elite American lawyers. She had massive political leverage backing her, operating with the strategic, behind-the-scenes support of her brother-in-law, United States Senator Ted Kennedy. Jackie's legal team identified a massive loophole. They argued that the 1968 prenuptial agreement was actually invalid under Greek law. Greek inheritance law at the time heavily protected widows. Legally, a surviving spouse was entitled to a legitime, a mandatory minimum share of the deceased husband's estate. Depending on the interpretation of the law, Jackie was legally positioned to claim anywhere from 12 5% to 25% of the entire Onassis global empire. This meant she could potentially seize control of a quarter of the supertanker fleet, a massive chunk of Olympic Airways, and prime real estate holdings worldwide. For Christina, this was the ultimate nightmare scenario. She had just spent 29 months burying her entire family and fighting to secure absolute control of the companies. The idea of handing a quarter of her father's life work over to Jacqueline Kennedy was physically repulsive to her. What followed was 18 months of grueling, hostile legal negotiations. The Onassis executives, known as the Palatine Guard, were furious. They wanted to take Jackie to court in Athens and destroy her legally. They believed that Greek judges would side with the Onassis bloodline over an American widow. Christina, however, proved to be far more pragmatic than her advisors. Despite her volatile temper, she understood the mechanics of risk. She realized that a trial in the Greek Supreme Court would take years. It would require opening the highly secretive Onassis financial books to the public, exposing the company to international tax authorities. Furthermore, the Kennedys had immense global influence. If the trial dragged on, it would paralyze the shipping operations. Christina made a cold, calculated decision. She would not fight Jackie in court. She would buy her out. Christina did not view this as a defeat. She viewed it as a necessary corporate transaction to achieve a personal goal: the permanent eradication of Jacqueline Kennedy from the Onassis history. She instructed her lead attorney, Stelios Papadimitriou, to bypass the Greek courts and negotiate a direct, lump-sum cash settlement. The negotiations were brutal. Jackie's team demanded an exorbitant payout, threatening to trigger the Greek inheritance lawsuit if Christina refused. Christina countered with strict conditions of absolute severance. Every detail of the Onassis estate was itemized and fought over. Finally, after a year and a half of intense legal warfare, an agreement was reached. On May 7, 1975, the two sides finalized a massive 23-page settlement document. The legal thoroughness of the contract was extreme. It required the initials of both parties no less than 17 times to ensure there were absolutely no loopholes. The financial numbers were staggering. Christina Onassis agreed to pay Jacqueline Kennedy a lump sum of $26 million in cash. In the mid-1970s, this was a monumental fortune. But for Christina, the money was irrelevant compared to what she extracted in return. The 23-page contract was essentially an ironclad eviction notice. In exchange for the $26 million, Jackie was forced to sign away every single legal right she had to the Onassis name and estate. She waived all future claims against Christina or the Onassis companies. More importantly, for Christina, Jackie was forced to surrender all property rights. Jackie was permanently legally banned from setting foot on the private island of Scorpios, the place where she had married Aristotle and where Aristotle, Alexander, and Tina were buried. Jackie also surrendered all rights to the legendary 325-foot yacht, the Christina O. Christina had successfully used her vast financial arsenal to execute a flawless surgical strike. She paid $26 million to buy back her father's island, her father's boat, and her own absolute sovereignty. When the ink dried on the contract, Jackie took the money and returned to New York, permanently exiled from the Greek shipping world. Christina had won the war. She had protected the fleet and expelled the intruder. But as the legal teams packed up their briefcases and the dust settled on the settlement, the reality of her victory set in. She had successfully cleared the board of her enemies, but she had also cleared it of everyone else. She was 24 years old, sitting on $1 billion, firmly in control of a global monopoly, and absolutely, terrifyingly alone. By 1975, Christina Onassis had successfully defended her empire. She had buried her family, neutralized the old guard executives, and legally exiled Jacqueline Kennedy. She possessed total, unmitigated control over $1 billion shipping syndicate. Yet this victory delivered a terrifying consequence: absolute silence. She lived in palatial estates and sprawling penthouses across Paris, London, and Manhattan. But these properties were empty. She had no parents, no siblings, and no genuine friends who were not on the company payroll. The trauma of her childhood, the severe emotional neglect, and the sudden, violent eradication of her family had completely destroyed her ability to form normal human attachments. She did not understand how to give or receive affection organically. For Christina, relationships were not built on trust. They were transactions. Money was the only language she understood, and she began to use her vast fortune to aggressively commodify the people around her. She did not make friends. She bought hostages. Her approach to intimacy was fundamentally transactional. The most glaring example of this was her relationship with Luis Basualdo, an Argentine polo player and known socialite. Basualdo did not love Christina, and she knew it. But he provided company, and Christina was willing to pay market rate for it. She placed Basualdo on a strict financial retainer. She paid him a direct salary of $30,000 every single month. This was not a business investment. It was a fee for personal access. In exchange for the money, Basualdo was required to be available to her at all times, specifically for sexual intimacy whenever she demanded it. The arrangement was so thoroughly financialized that Christina even paid the living expenses for Basualdo's actual girlfriend. She allocated an estimated $360,000 a year to subsidize their lives, just to ensure Basualdo remained within her immediate orbit. Every interaction with Christina carried a specific price tag. She stripped away the concept of human favors and replaced it with direct compensation. In one highly documented instance, she wanted a neighbor's cat brought over to her residence to play with her dog. Instead of asking a staff member or a friend, she paid an acquaintance $500 simply to walk the cat next door. This financial control was absolute, but her paranoia made it volatile. At one point, convinced she was being exploited, Christina filed a massive lawsuit against Basualdo, accusing him of a conspiracy to embezzle $2 million from her accounts. The legal filing sent shockwaves through their social circle. But just as quickly as she filed it, she withdrew it. The money did not matter. The lawsuit was simply a mechanism to flex her power, to remind him that she could destroy him legally if he ever attempted to leave. When direct payment was too overt, Christina used debt to build psychological prisons for her associates. She understood that a massive loan was the most effective way to secure permanent loyalty. She targeted the Dodero family, prominent members of the South American elite. Christina issued them a staggering $4 million loan, entirely interest-free. On paper, it looked like extreme generosity. In reality, it was a pair of golden handcuffs. By accepting the money, the Doderos essentially surrendered their autonomy to her. The unwritten condition of the loan was absolute availability. They were forced to attend every party she hosted, travel whenever she demanded, and act as a constant captive audience to stave off her crushing loneliness. They could not refuse her invitations because they could not afford to repay the principal. She applied the exact same tactic to Nicky Mavrolian, a younger man in her social circle. She loaned him $50,000. For 3 months, this debt tethered him to her. When Mavrolian eventually reached his limit with her erratic behavior and attempted to sever the relationship, Christina panicked. Abandonment was her core trigger. Desperate to stop him from walking out the door, Christina triggered the exact same emergency brake she had used against Jacqueline Kennedy. She falsely claimed she was carrying his child, deploying the fabricated pregnancy to completely paralyze his exit. This intense psychological instability bled heavily into her daily routines, manifesting as extreme, unchecked eccentricities. When a normal person develops a quirk, it is limited by their resources. When a billionaire develops a quirk, it becomes a massive logistical operation. Christina developed a severe, relentless addiction to Coca-Cola. During her time at an exclusive boarding school in Switzerland, she refused to walk to a local store to buy the drink. Instead, she paid to have a commercial Coca-Cola vending machine permanently installed directly inside the school, purely for her personal use. As she grew older and took control of the shipping fleet, the addiction escalated. While living in Europe, she decided she only liked the specific taste of Coca-Cola bottled in the United States. To satisfy this hyper-specific craving, she routinely dispatched a 10-seat private jet to fly across the Atlantic Ocean to New York City. The plane would land, ground crews would load exactly 100 bottles of American Coca-Cola into the cabin, and the jet would immediately fly back to Paris. She burned thousands of gallons of aviation fuel and spent tens of thousands of dollars just to secure a specific brand of soda. It was a staggering display of logistical power used to satisfy a completely irrational impulse. Her physical insecurities, deeply ingrained by her mother's rejection, evolved into a paralyzing obsession with her appearance. She was acutely aware that she did not possess the slender, classical beauty that the media constantly praised in her mother, Tina, or her nemesis, Jackie Kennedy. Christina hated her own reflection. She would spend hours locked in her bathroom, staring intensely into the mirror, hyper-analyzing every flaw on her face and body. Her wardrobe was endless, filled with the most expensive couture on the planet, but it brought her no comfort. If she put on a dress and noticed a single microscopic wrinkle in the fabric, she would immediately tear the garment off and force her staff to bring her an entirely new outfit. When her depression peaked, Christina turned her residences into authoritarian black sites. She could not buy happiness, so she used her authority to enforce shared misery. When she hosted guests at her estates, she instituted a set of bizarre dictatorial house rules. The most rigid rule was regarding sleep. Christina suffered from severe insomnia, terrified of being alone in the dark. Therefore, she decreed that no one in the house was allowed to go to sleep before she did. Guests, regardless of their own schedules or exhaustion, were forced to stay awake, drink, and entertain her until she finally decided to go to bed, often as the sun was rising. But the most disturbing manifestation of her psychological damage was her absolute prohibition of intimacy among others. Christina was starved of genuine love, and her envy was toxic. She could not tolerate the idea that people under her roof were experiencing the affection she was denied. Therefore, she enacted a strict ban on all sexual activity between her houseguests. She did not rely on the honor system to enforce this rule. She instituted a deeply invasive protocol. Every morning, after her guests had finally been allowed to sleep and had left their bedrooms, Christina deployed her personal maid, a woman named Eleni. Eleni's specific mandated task was to strip the guest beds and physically smell the bed sheets. She was searching for the scent of sex. Christina demanded daily reports from Eleni to confirm that her guests had maintained total chastity during the night. This was the reality of the Onassis empire under Christina. She sat at the head of a global boardroom, feared by executives and tracked by international media. Behind closed doors, she was a deeply broken woman, paying men for sex, trapping friends with debt, flying jets for soda, and forcing her maid to sniff bed sheets just to ensure no one else was happy. Her fortune was limitless, but her descent into total self-destruction had only just begun. Christina Onassis did not understand how to navigate romantic relationships. For her, love was not an organic connection. It was a target to be acquired. Her childhood had taught her a brutal lesson. Affection is never given freely. It must be forced, bought, or manipulated. Driven by a desperate, gaping need for validation, Christina entered her adult years completely ill-equipped to handle rejection. When she wanted a man, she did not date him. She orchestrated a siege. The psychological blueprint for her disastrous romantic life was finalized when she was just 18 years old. She developed an intense, consuming obsession with Peter Goulandris, a young heir from a rival Greek shipping dynasty. It was her first attempt at securing a traditional high society alliance. However, Peter's mother viewed the Onassis family as chaotic and strictly prohibited the relationship. Peter obeyed his family and pulled away. For a normal teenager, this would be a heartbreak. For Christina, it was a psychological emergency. She concluded that the rejection was entirely based on her physical appearance. In a desperate, extreme bid to win him back, the 18-year-old checked herself into a surgical clinic. She underwent painful plastic surgery to alter the shape of her nose and permanently remove the congenital dark circles under her eyes. She believed that if she could simply carve her mother's classical beauty into her own face, Peter would return. He did not. The surgical intervention failed to change his mind. Faced with absolute rejection, Christina escalated her tactics. She swallowed a lethal dose of sleeping pills. She was discovered in time, rushed to a hospital, and her stomach was pumped. She survived, but the psychological precedent was set. The suicide attempt was not merely a cry for pain, it was a calculated extortion tactic. She learned that self-destruction forces people to pay attention. However, her actions carried collateral damage. The overdose deeply traumatized her mother, Tina. It exposed Tina to the reality of severe depression, inadvertently pushing her toward the fatal reliance on barbiturates that would kill her years later. Christina's subsequent attempts at romance were defined by chaotic rebellion. She was determined to punish her family while simultaneously begging for their approval. She pursued Mick Flick, the incredibly wealthy heir to the Mercedes-Benz empire. Knowing he preferred a specific aesthetic, she aggressively bleached her naturally dark hair to a blinding, artificial blonde. Flick was repulsed by the desperation and rejected her flatly. She then pivoted to Danny Marentet, a handsome American. Within barely a week of knowing him, she fell back on her most ruthless psychological trap, falsely announcing a pregnancy to force his immediate commitment. Ironically, as the relationship progressed, she did actually become pregnant. However, the sudden shocking suicide of her aunt Eugenie Archos terrified Christina. Paralyzed by the idea of bringing a child into her cursed, unstable bloodline, she aborted the pregnancy and abruptly severed ties with Marentet. By 1971, Christina was exhausted by rejection. She decided she would no longer ask for marriage. She would demand it. Enter Joseph Bolker. Bolker was a wealthy Los Angeles real estate developer. He was 48 years old. Christina was 20. He was a divorced father of 4, 27 years her senior. For Christina, Bolker represented stability and a direct mechanism to enrage her father. When they began dating, Bolker realized the massive psychological baggage Christina carried and attempted to distance himself. He tried to politely end the relationship. Christina immediately deployed her ultimate leverage. She began swallowing sleeping pills again, but this time with a direct spoken threat. She told Bolker explicitly, "I will keep doing this until you marry me." The blackmail worked. Terrified of having the blood of the Onassis heiress on his hands, Bolker capitulated. They were married in July 1971. The reaction from the Onassis patriarch was explosive. Aristotle was furious. He viewed Bolker as an opportunistic American exploiting his psychologically fragile daughter. Aristotle retaliated with the only weapon he respected, money. He instantly severed Christina from her massive $75 million trust fund, effectively cutting off her cash flow. At this exact moment, her mother Tina intervened. Tina approached Christina and offered her $200,000 in cash to buy a house in Los Angeles. To Christina, this felt like a rare moment of maternal support. It was an illusion. Tina did not care about the marriage to Bolker. Tina was currently planning to marry Stavros Niarchos, the man suspected of driving her sister to suicide. Tina knew this marriage would cause a massive public scandal. The $200,000 was a bribe. It was payment to secure Christina's public blessing for her mother's highly controversial wedding. When Christina realized the truth, that her mother had literally bought her compliance, she was shattered. She realized she was not a daughter. She was just a pawn in her parents' PR strategies. Stripped of the illusion of family support, the marriage to Bolker lost its utility. She filed for divorce after exactly 9 months. 4 years later, the Onassis family was entirely wiped out by plane crashes and disease. By the summer of 1975, Christina was 24, an orphan, and the sole dictator of the Onassis shipping fleet. The isolation was absolute. She was surrounded by executives who feared her and staff who were paid to tolerate her. In a state of pure, unmanaged grief, she made her most impulsive decision yet. In July 1975, just months after burying her father, she met Alexander Andreidis, a fellow Greek banking and shipping heir. They spoke. They recognized a shared background. Exactly 8 days later, they were engaged. The marriage was a catastrophic collision of two massive egos. It was a trauma response, not a romance. Christina was desperately trying to recreate a family structure to replace the one she had just lost. Andreidis, however, saw an opportunity for a corporate merger. He attempted to exert influence over the Onassis shipping operations. He vastly underestimated his new wife. Christina had just fought off Jacqueline Kennedy and the entire Onassis executive board. She was not going to hand her empire over to a man she had known for a week. When Andreidis tried to lead, Christina shut him down with aggressive, humiliating authority. The relationship fractured immediately. After 13 months of bitter, high-volume arguments, they divorced. By 1978, Christina had exhausted the Western pool of suitors. She was 27 years old, twice divorced, and entirely bored with the predictability of European high society. She decided to purchase an entirely different type of husband. During a series of tense maritime negotiations regarding global oil routes, Christina met Sergei Kauzov. Kauzov was a middle-ranking official in the Soviet shipping ministry. More importantly, Western intelligence agencies had clearly identified him as an active operative for the KGB. He was bald, missing a front tooth, and possessed a glass eye. He was the absolute antithesis of the polished billionaires Christina usually associated with. There was only one obstacle. Sergei Kauzov was already married and had a young daughter. For Christina, this was not a moral dilemma, it was simply a financial hurdle. She approached the problem like a corporate buyout. She bypassed Sergei and went directly to his wife. Christina deployed her vast wealth, literally paying the Soviet woman a massive, undisclosed sum of cash to quietly divorce Sergei and disappear. The buyout was successful. In August 1978, the absolute sovereign of global capitalism married an operative of the Soviet communist state. The international press was stunned. Political analysts questioned if the KGB had successfully infiltrated the world's largest private shipping fleet. Christina ignored them. In a display of extreme rebellion against her luxurious upbringing, she relocated to Moscow. She moved out of her Paris penthouses and into a cramped two-bedroom Soviet apartment shared with Sergei and his mother. For a few months, the stark austerity of the Soviet Union fascinated her. It was a complete departure from the suffocating luxury she had always known. But the novelty evaporated rapidly. Christina did not know how to cook, clean, or navigate the heavily rationed Soviet grocery stores. The brutalist architecture and the constant surveillance depressed her. Furthermore, the KGB realized that Christina was entirely too volatile to control, and Sergei had no actual influence over her financial assets. The boredom became intolerable. The marriage officially ended after 2 years. To expedite the divorce and secure her exit from the Soviet Union, Christina treated the dissolution exactly like a severance package. She did not fight over alimony. She simply transferred the ownership of 2 massive, fully operational commercial cargo ships, valued at over $7 million, directly to Sergei Kauzov and his mother. She paid her exit fee, boarded her private jet, and flew back to Western Europe. By the age of 30, Christina Onassis had 3 failed marriages. She had used extortion, bribery, and multi-million-dollar payoffs to acquire husbands. She had learned how to successfully buy a man. What she was about to learn, in her 4th and final marriage, was that the men she bought were perfectly capable of destroying her. By 1983, Christina Onassis was in her early 30s, possessed a net worth of roughly $1 billion, and was entirely spiritually bankrupt. She had survived a childhood of severe emotional neglect, buried her entire family in less than 3 years, and engineered 3 catastrophic marriages using bribery and extortion. She had learned that money could force a man to stand at an altar, but she had not yet realized that money could not stop him from destroying her once he got there. This brutal lesson was delivered by her 4th and final husband, Thierry Roussel. Thierry Roussel was a French businessman and an heir to a prominent pharmaceutical fortune. He was tall, conventionally handsome, and deeply embedded in the European playboy circuit. He was also completely undeniably indifferent to Christina. Roussel did not love her. More importantly, he did not even pretend to love her. He approached their relationship with the cold, calculating detachment of a corporate auditor assessing a damaged asset. He recognized that Christina was desperate for a child and terrified of dying alone. He knew she possessed limitless financial resources. Roussel was perfectly willing to provide her with a marriage and an heir, but he demanded an extreme, highly specific price. He did not just want her money. He wanted absolute physical submission. Since childhood, Christina had suffered from a deep-seated physical insecurity directly inherited from her mother's rejection of her heavy-set appearance. Her weight had always fluctuated dramatically, driven by severe depression, stress eating, and a massive daily intake of Coca-Cola. When Roussel entered the picture, she was at her heaviest. Roussel viewed her weight not as a health issue, but as an aesthetic breach of contract. Before he would even agree to an engagement, he issued a dictatorial, physically punishing ultimatum. He looked at the billionaire heiress and told her flatly he would not marry her until she lost exactly 80 pounds. For a woman with basic self-esteem, this demand would have ended the relationship instantly. For Christina, trapped in a lifelong cycle of seeking validation through men, it was an instruction manual. She accepted the terms of her own degradation. She checked herself into an exclusive, highly restrictive medical weight loss clinic in Paris. This was not a standard diet. It was a medically supervised starvation program. She subjected her body to extreme deprivation, subsisting on heavily restricted caloric intake, aggressive fluid draining, and massive doses of appetite suppressants and amphetamines to kill her hunger and maintain her energy. She endured grueling physical routines while entirely isolated from her corporate responsibilities. The physical toll was massive, but the psychological damage was worse. By agreeing to Roussel's flesh tax, Christina handed him absolute psychological dominance. She allowed a man to explicitly confirm the worst fear her mother had ever instilled in her, that she was fundamentally physically repulsive in her natural state. After months of chemical and physical punishment, Christina hit the target weight. She had starved herself down to a skeletal frame to meet Roussel's specifications. To ensure the transaction was finalized, Christina deployed her standard financial insurance. Just days before they walked down the aisle, she transferred a staggering $10 million in cash directly into Roussel's personal accounts. It was not a wedding gift, it was a preemptive payoff. She was buying his compliance. They were married in March 1984. The international press celebrated the union, noting Christina's dramatic physical transformation. Behind the cameras, the dynamic was strictly transactional. Roussel had secured his multi-million-dollar payout. Christina had secured the genetic material she needed to produce an heir. In January 1985, Christina gave birth to a daughter in Switzerland. She named the girl Athena after the mother who had fundamentally rejected her. For a brief, fleeting moment, Christina experienced genuine happiness. The birth of Athena was the only pure, non-transactional event of her adult life. She was utterly devoted to the infant. She showered the child with the affection she had never received, famously buying Athena a custom-built miniature Ferrari and a private zoo. She believed the birth of a child would finally anchor Roussel to the marriage. She believed the transaction was complete and her family was secure. She was completely wrong. The illusion lasted exactly 6 months. In the summer of 1985, the architecture of Roussel's deception collapsed, revealing a level of betrayal that was staggering even by the standards of the European elite. Christina discovered that Roussel had not merely been unfaithful. He had built an entirely separate, parallel family while married to her. Before and during his relationship with Christina, Roussel had maintained a serious relationship with a Swedish model and translator named Marianne Gabi Landhage. Gabi was everything Christina was not: tall, blonde, naturally slender, and entirely removed from the chaotic pressure of the Onassis empire. Roussel had never stopped seeing Gabi. He had simply compartmentalized his life. He used Christina in Paris and Greece to fund his lifestyle and secure a billion-dollar inheritance line, while he maintained his genuine emotional and physical relationship with Gabi in Malmö, Sweden. The timeline of the betrayal was surgical and devastating. In July 1985, just 6 months after Christina gave birth to Athena in a highly publicized hospital suite, Gabi Landhage quietly gave birth to a son in Sweden. The father was Thierry Roussel. When Christina uncovered the truth, the psychological devastation was absolute. It was a direct, targeted strike at every single vulnerability she possessed. The husband she had starved herself for, the man she had paid $10 million to marry, had secretly fathered a child with a beautiful blonde woman at the exact same time she was pregnant with his daughter. A standard corporate executive would have immediately initiated a hostile divorce, severed his access to the Onassis fortune, and destroyed him legally. But Christina was not operating on logic. She was operating on severe attachment trauma. Instead of throwing Roussel out, she internalized the humiliation. She panicked. Her core fear of abandonment overrode her dignity. She actually attempted to accommodate the mistress. In a display of staggering psychological subservience, the billionaire heiress accepted the reality of a shared husband. She allowed Roussel to split his time between her estates and Gabi's home in Sweden. She funded the very man who was actively humiliating her on a global scale. The situation devolved into total absurdity. Roussel continued the affair with zero consequences. He spent Onassis money while spending his time with Gabi. Incredibly, while still legally married to Christina and living off her wealth, Roussel impregnated Gabi a second time. By 1987, the public humiliation was too massive to ignore. The Onassis board of directors was deeply alarmed by Roussel's proximity to the company's assets. Under intense pressure from her legal advisors and entirely broken in spirit, Christina filed for divorce. The marriage officially ended. However, the legal paperwork did not sever her psychological dependency. The divorce merely stripped away the final layers of her self-respect. Christina Onassis, a woman who controlled a global fleet of supertankers and possessed the financial leverage to destabilize small countries, found herself begging the man who had publicly destroyed her. She wanted a second child. She did not want just any child. She specifically wanted a sibling for Athena, and she wanted Roussel to be the father. She approached her ex-husband with a purely financial proposition. She offered to buy him a custom, top-of-the-line Ferrari valued at $160,000. On top of the car, she guaranteed him a direct, untraceable cash payment of $10 million. The terms of her offer were brutally sad. She did not ask for his love. She did not ask for a reconciliation. She did not even ask for joint custody or his presence in the child's life. She offered $10 million and a supercar strictly in exchange for his sperm. She wanted to buy a biological deposit. Roussel's response finalized her destruction. He accepted the financial payouts she continued to throw at him, but he coldly, explicitly rejected her request for a second child. He had secured his wealth, he had his heir in Athena, and he had his actual family with Gabi in Sweden. Christina had exhausted her utility. This final rejection snapped the last remaining tether Christina had to reality. The money had failed. The starvation had failed. The bribery had failed. She had allowed a man to strip her of her dignity, her physical health, and her pride, and he still walked away. The realization that she was utterly powerless, despite sitting on $1 billion, triggered a catastrophic psychological collapse. There were no more husbands to buy. There were no more clinics to check into. There was only the absolute suffocating silence of the Onassis empire and a rapidly escalating reliance on the chemical narcotics that would soon silence her permanently. The rejection by Thierry Roussel in 1987 was not just the end of a marriage. It was the absolute termination of Christina Onassis's will to live. For 37 years, she had attempted to use her immense billion-dollar inheritance to buy the basic human connections that had been denied to her since birth. She bought a husband for $10 million, starved herself to fit his exact physical specifications, and offered him a fleet of supercars just to secure a second child. When he took her money and returned to his mistress, the central operating theory of Christina's life, that wealth could force affection, completely collapsed. Without that delusion to sustain her, she plummeted into a state of total, unmanaged self-destruction. The psychological trauma that began with her mother's disgust and was compounded by the sudden deaths of her entire family finally overtook her physical body. Christina retreated from the boardrooms of the Onassis shipping empire. The daily operations of the supertankers and the massive real estate portfolios were delegated to the Greek executives, the so-called Palatine Guard. Christina isolated herself in her global properties, turning her vast fortune toward a single fatal objective, the chemical suppression of her own consciousness. She did not use drugs for recreational euphoria. She used them as a clinical anesthetic against reality. Her lifelong habit of self-harm, which had begun with a failed suicide attempt via sleeping pills at age 18, and escalated to slitting her wrists after the death of her father, now evolved into severe, systemic substance abuse. The pharmaceutical regimen she subjected her body to was staggering and highly contradictory. To combat her chronic, crippling depression, she consumed massive quantities of heavy antidepressants. To manage the severe insomnia that had haunted her since she was a child, she took powerful barbiturates and sedatives. Simultaneously, she was terrified of regaining the weight she had lost for Roussel. To control her appetite, she ingested dangerous levels of amphetamines and chemical appetite suppressants. She was actively forcing her central nervous system into a state of permanent whiplash. She used uppers to force her heart to race and kill her hunger, then immediately used heavy downers to force her brain to shut off so she could sleep. The physical consequences were grotesque. Her endocrine system collapsed. Her weight fluctuated with violent unpredictability. During periods of severe chemical suppression, she became alarmingly emaciated. When the pills temporarily lost their efficacy, she would binge eat under severe stress, causing her weight to instantly balloon up to over 90 kilograms. Her internal organs were subjected to the strain of a body constantly expanding and starving. As the addiction deepened, oral medication ceased to be effective. Her tolerance levels were so high that standard dosages of sedatives had no impact. To bypass her digestive system and achieve immediate numbness, Christina weaponized her wealth to secure direct intravenous access to narcotics. She placed a private full-time nurse on her payroll. This nurse was stationed in her home, on call 24 hours a day. The nurse's primary unwritten duty was to physically inject potent pharmaceutical cocktails directly into Christina's veins when the psychological pain became intolerable. She was a billionaire sitting at the top of the global economy, living the daily reality of a hardcore street addict. By the autumn of 1988, Christina realized that Europe was a toxic environment for her. Paris and Switzerland were completely saturated with the presence of Thierry Roussel and his new parallel family with Gaby Landhage. The European tabloid press documented Roussel's every move, constantly reminding Christina of her ultimate humiliation. She needed to completely sever herself from the continent. In November 1988, she boarded a plane and flew to Buenos Aires, Argentina. She sought refuge at the Tortugas Country Club estate of Marina Dodaro. Marina was a member of the elite South American family that Christina had previously trapped with a $4 million interest-free loan. Despite the transactional nature of their early relationship, Marina was one of the very few people who provided Christina with a semblance of stable companionship. In Argentina, removed from the corporate pressure of Monaco and the social humiliation of Paris, Christina exhibited a sudden, desperate burst of optimism. She spoke actively about abandoning her chaotic European lifestyle entirely. She formulated a concrete plan to purchase a massive isolated ranch in the Argentine countryside. Her stated goal was to bring her 3-year-old daughter, Athena, to South America and raise her in total privacy, away from the paparazzi, the Greek executives, and the toxic influence of the Roussel family. On the evening of November 18, 1988, she seemed highly functional. Early the next morning, she woke up and walked barefoot through the manicured gardens of the Dodaro estate. She felt a slight chill and returned inside, noting that she might have caught a cold. She picked up the telephone and placed an international call to Switzerland to speak with young Athena. According to staff who overheard the conversation, Christina was cheerful. She spoke animatedly to her daughter, promising to buy her a specific pony she had been asking for. It was a mundane, happy conversation. It was the exact type of maternal interaction Christina had craved her entire life. It was also the last conversation she would ever have. At approximately 10 a.m. on November 19, 1988, Marina Dodaro realized she had not seen Christina since the early morning. Marina went to the guest suite. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. Marina forced the door open and walked into the bathroom. She found Christina Onassis lying motionless in the bathtub. She was partially undressed. There was no water running. Marina pulled her out of the tub and desperately attempted to resuscitate her, screaming for the estate staff to call for an ambulance. Medical personnel rushed to the country club, but all intervention was completely futile. The heiress to the greatest maritime fortune in modern history was pronounced dead on the scene. Christina Onassis was 37 years old. She died exactly 1 month before her 38th birthday. The immediate aftermath of her death triggered a massive, highly controversial forensic investigation. The Argentine police locked down the guest suite. When detectives cataloged the contents of Christina's bedroom, the scale of her chemical dependency was laid bare. Scattered across the nightstands, inside her luggage, and in the bathroom cabinets, investigators recovered exactly 41 different vials and bottles of heavy prescription medication. The most prominent drug found at the scene was a medication called Optalidin. Optalidin is a potent analgesic that in its formulation at the time contained a barbiturate derivative. It is highly addictive, and in large quantities, it acts as a severe central nervous system depressant. The official autopsy was conducted by Argentine pathologists. Their final, documented conclusion regarding the cause of death was acute pulmonary edema, a condition where the lungs rapidly fill with fluid, starving the body and brain of oxygen, followed immediately by cardiac arrest. This medical conclusion sent a shockwave of horror through the remaining Onassis loyalists. Pulmonary edema was the exact same physiological mechanism that had killed Christina's mother, Tina Livanos, 14 years prior, following a massive barbiturate overdose. The exact nature of Christina's death immediately became the subject of intense, permanent debate among investigators, medical professionals, and biographers. There were 3 distinct theories. The first theory was intentional suicide. Given her history of suicide attempts and her profound, documented depression regarding Roussel, many assumed she simply swallowed a lethal handful of pills to end her life. However, investigators largely discounted this. People planning to commit suicide do not typically wake up, walk in the garden, and place an international phone call to their 3-year-old daughter to happily discuss buying a pony. The second theory was an accidental overdose. It was highly probable that Christina, suffering from her chronic insomnia, simply lost track of how many barbiturates she had ingested during the night. Seeking sleep, she may have inadvertently crossed the lethal threshold of Optalidin, causing her respiratory system to shut down while she was in the bathroom. The third and most clinically sound theory was cumulative systemic failure. The autopsy revealed a body that was biologically decades older than 37. Christina had spent over 20 years subjecting her internal organs to a brutal cycle of extreme starvation diets, heavy amphetamines to accelerate her heart rate, and powerful barbiturates to slow it down. The human cardiovascular system is not designed to withstand that level of sustained chemical whiplash. The ultimate consensus among many medical experts reviewing the case was that her heart simply gave out. The muscle had been weakened by decades of abuse, and on the morning of November 19, it simply stopped beating. Within hours of the autopsy, the Greek executives of the Onassis Empire mobilized. They dispatched a private jet to Buenos Aires to retrieve her remains. Christina's body was flown across the Atlantic, bypassing the European cities where she had suffered so much, and was taken directly to the Ionian Sea. She was brought to Scorpios, the private island purchased by her father, the island where he had married Jackie Kennedy, and the island that served as the family's exclusive sanctuary. A team of workers opened the family mausoleum. Christina Onassis was placed inside a white marble tomb. She was laid to rest directly beside the father who had ignored her and the brother whose death had destroyed her. With her burial, the biological era of the Onassis dynasty was permanently extinguished. The aftermath of her death executed a final brutal irony on her legacy. Upon Christina's death, the entire Onassis empire, the 55% of the global assets not controlled by the foundation, passed to a single individual, 3-year-old Athena Onassis. She instantly became the richest child on the planet, inheriting an estimated fortune over $1 billion, including the shipping fleet, the real estate, and the island of Scorpios. Because Athena was a toddler, the legal control of this staggering wealth was immediately seized by a board of trustees. Christina's will designated 4 trusted Greek executives, Stelio Papadimitriou, Paul Ioannidis, Apostolos Zabelas, and Theodore Gabrielides, to manage the money until Athena came of age. But while the Greeks controlled the corporate assets, they did not control the child. Under international custody laws, the sole surviving parent was granted absolute guardianship. The most devastating consequence of Christina's death was that Thierry Roussel, the man who had publicly humiliated her, starved her, and rejected her, was handed total, uncontested control over her only daughter. Athena was taken away from her Greek roots. She was moved to a highly guarded estate in Lucy-sur-Morge, Switzerland. She was raised in the exact environment that had destroyed her mother's sanity. Athena grew up in a household managed by Thierry Roussel and his mistress, Gabi Landhague, the woman who had been Roussel's parallel partner during his marriage to Christina. Athena was raised alongside the half-siblings that Roussel had fathered with Gabi while taking Christina's money. Roussel immediately weaponized his status as the guardian of the billionaire heiress. He initiated a vicious, decade-long legal war against the Greek Board of Trustees. He demanded massive, multi-million-dollar annual stipends from the Onassis estate, simply to fund his own lavish lifestyle, claiming the money was necessary for Athena's security and upkeep. The Greek executives despised Roussel, viewing him as a parasite draining the Onassis fortune, and fought him bitterly in Swiss courts. Caught in the crossfire of this toxic financial war, Athena developed a profound, deep-seated hatred for everything associated with her Onassis bloodline. She was taught nothing about her grandfather's maritime legacy. She did not learn to speak Greek. She completely rejected the opulent, highly public lifestyle that had characterized her mother and grandfather. Athena recognized the money as a curse. She reportedly told her stepmother, Gabi, that if she could, she would burn all the Onassis money to rid herself of the family's dark history. She sought refuge in the highly disciplined, isolated world of professional equestrian show jumping. She married a Brazilian Olympic show jumper, Álvaro de Miranda Neto, in 2005. For a time, it seemed she had escaped the family trauma. But the Onassis pattern of betrayal repeated itself. In 2017, Athena underwent a brutal, highly publicized divorce after discovering that her husband had been carrying on an affair with a blonde show jumper for years, mirroring the exact betrayal her mother suffered with Roussel. Athena responded by systematically dismantling the physical remnants of the Onassis empire. She cut ties with the Greek board of directors. She sold off the family's prime real estate in Paris and London. She sold her mother's legendary jewelry at auction. Then, in 2013, she executed the ultimate erasure of her grandfather's legacy. For $153 million, Athena Onassis sold a long-term lease, effectively selling the ownership of the island of Scorpios to Ekaterina Rybolovleva, the daughter of a Russian billionaire oligarch. She handed over the beaches where Winston Churchill had walked. She handed over the harbor that had birthed the global supertanker industry. Most significantly, she handed over the white marble mausoleum containing the remains of Aristotle, Alexander, and Christina. The sale of Scorpios was the final definitive act of destruction. The Onassis Empire was not defeated by a rival shipping syndicate, nor was it dismantled by international tax authorities. It was liquidated by its own heir, an heiress who realized that the name she carried was entirely synonymous with misery. With a single signature, the Onassis dynasty was officially wiped off the map of global power. The story of the Onassis family is one of the most thoroughly documented studies in the absolute limits of financial power. Aristotle Onassis fundamentally altered the architecture of global trade. He proved that a private citizen, armed with enough capital and leverage, could operate with the sovereignty of a nation-state. He built an empire of steel and oil that dictated international markets for decades. But the legacy he left behind was a complete psychological wasteland. The Onassis wealth functioned as a massive magnifying glass, taking standard human flaws, greed, infidelity, insecurity, and inflating them to a level of catastrophic destruction. The fortune protected them from poverty, but it completely isolated them from reality, accountability, and genuine human connection. The dynasty proved that while capital can control governments and industries, it is entirely useless in stabilizing the human psyche. When the money became the only metric of value in the family destroyed itself from the inside out. Christina Onassis spent her entire 37-year existence attempting to solve a psychological deficit with a financial surplus. She was handed $1 billion and a global monopoly, yet she lived in a state of perpetual emotional famine. She was a woman who could summon a private jet to cross the Atlantic Ocean on a whim, but she could not find a single person who wanted to sit in the seat next to her without being paid to do so. Her life is not a tragedy of lost wealth. It is a tragedy of fundamental human deprivation. She was rejected by the mother who birthed her, neglected by the father who funded her, and exploited by the men who married her. She died entirely alone in a guest bathroom, her body broken by the drugs she used to silence the pain of her isolation. The definitive lesson of the Onassis empire is stark, brutal, and historically absolute. You can buy the oceans, you can buy the islands, and you can buy the people, but you cannot buy a reason to survive.